Hi all. So this week's topic is demography and the epidemiologic profile of American racial ethnic minorities. In essence, the purpose of this lecture is to explore the degree of racial ethnic diversity of the U.S. Let's get started. So, what is demography? Demography is the study of population and examines a host of different factors such as race and ethnicity, age, births, and other indicators mentioned here. For the sake of time and your boredom, I won't review each of these in great depth. However, I'll just show a couple of examples of these indicators and how our population fares as relates to race ethnicity. By all means, you can always take a look at demographic trends on your own. For instance, you can visit the Census Bureau website at www.census.gov and type American Fact Finder in the search bar and have fun seeing what trends exist. First, let's begin describing how societal demographic changes occur. In the reading for this week, Levis describes the demographic transition model. This model was developed in the early 20th century and initially identified 4 stages by which societies evolve. Levis added a 5th stage and termed it the multiculturalism stage. The model highlights the economic development of a society, which has implications for birth rates, death rates, and population changes. The pre-modern stage is characterized by farming communities, which predominate. The high death rate was a result of uncontrolled infections, injuries, famine, and food insecurity. During the second stage, the early industrial stage, mechanization is beginning to be used in agriculture, which increases food production and lessens the labor needed to produce food. Also, people begin to migrate to urban areas for jobs, and birth rates remain high, mainly because of cultural norms favoring large family sizes. During the third stage, the mature industrial stage, death rates decline as public health controls improve water quality and food safety and prevent infectious disease. Birth rates decline as more women find opportunities in urban areas. Cultural norms about large family sizes begin to change in urban life, and life expectancy rises as primary causes of death transition from infectious diseases to chronic diseases, the epidemiologic transition. During the fourth stage, the post-industrial stage, highly mechanized agriculture brings excellent food security, and a highly evolved public health infrastructure prevents much of the infectious disease burden of the past. Medical advances help to extend and increase life expectancy. During the fifth stage, multiculturalism, which was added by Levis, births decline below the replacement rate, which is the number of births needed to balance deaths to sustain the population. Population increases due to immigration, and immigrants are more likely of childbearing years and culturally have higher birth rates. Thus, the combined younger age and higher birth rate relative to the U.S. born population accelerates the cultural diversity of the society. It is likely that the new immigrant wave will transform the society rather than be absorbed into society. For example, as evidenced by an increasing number of people noting that they speak more than one language at home. Now I'll present a few tables and graphs that illustrate some of the demographic trends occurring in the U.S. Here, you'll see data from the most recent census that shows the racial makeup of the U.S. As indicated here, nearly 64% of the population is white, followed by nearly 13% Black or African American, with the next largest proportion represented by persons of some other race than those mentioned here at 6.2%. Here then is the most recent census data indicating the ethnic makeup of our population. Here we see that 16.3% of our population is of Latino ethnicity. Remember that one can be of Latino origin in any race. Among those of Latin descent, we see most identifying as Mexican, followed by Puerto Rican and Central American. We will explore this a bit more closely when we discuss the Latino population later in the term. The American Community Survey, or ACS, is an excellent example of how demographic data is collected. This survey is conducted annually by the Census Bureau and is used to provide vital information on a yearly basis about our nation and its people. Information collected from the ACS data also helps determine how more than $400 billion in federal and state funds are distributed each year. There are multiple ways to respond to the ACS, including via phone, online, through mail, and by in-person interviews. The graphic on this slide is taken from the American Community Survey website and describes how the ACS works for one's community, from collection of the data through how the data is used for decision making at the government level. Take a moment to peruse the ACS website and graphic for more details. Here is a graph indicating what I mentioned a lecture or two ago about the changing status of the minority population in the U.S. If you look at the first bar, you'll see that a little over 60% of the population as of 2015 was white, non-Hispanic, followed by about 15% of Hispanic origin and 12% of African American descent. In the year 2030, we see an overall increase in the growth of the racial ethnic population growing. For example, by way of racial composition, estimates for 2045 indicate that the white population will be represented by less than half of the total population, actually 46.3%, followed by 30% Hispanic and approximately 12% African Americans. This is a good illustration of the eventuality that minorities will become the majority during many of our lifetimes. So, I've given you a bit of information about how to define and examine demography and provided some information about the demographic trends in the U.S. Let's now shift slightly to discuss the epidemiologic profile of American racial ethnic minorities in the U.S. Different from studying the demographic characteristics of the population, epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of mortality and morbidity in human populations. The objectives of epidemiology are to identify causes of disease and risk factors, determine the extent of disease in a community, study the natural history or progression of disease, and provide a foundation for developing public policy. Now, let's review a few epidemiologic terms, and I'll show some tables and graphs that help illustrate some of these terms. The first couple of key terms are prevalence and incidence. Prevalence is defined as the number of occurrences of a given disease or condition within a given population at a given point in time. By contrast, incidence is defined as the number of new cases of a given disease or condition within a given population of persons who are at risk of getting the disease at a given point in time. Life expectancy is an important indicator of population health and measures the expected number of years that the average person within a given birth cohort can expect to live if present trends in mortality rates do not change. So let's view a few graphs that illustrate these terms. This figure is a bar graph showing life expectancy at birth by sex and race ethnicity in the United States spanning from 1980 to 2014. What do you see? Do you see similarities across race ethnicity? And what about differences? If we look at the graph on the left, we see that the life expectancy for Black and white males and females has steadily increased over the years. If we look at the graph on the right, we see a breakdown in life expectancy as it relates to Hispanic or Latino, white non-Hispanic, and Black non-Hispanic individuals. Do you see anything surprising? This graph actually shows us that Hispanic or Latino males and females have the highest life expectancy when compared to whites and Blacks. If we are to presume that racial ethnic minorities tend to have worse health outcomes, we could be surprised by this finding. We will discuss why this occurrence happens in a later lecture, so stay tuned. Morbidity is another important term. It is defined as any departure, subjective or objective, from a state of physiological or psychological well-being. Morbidity is a key term because it gives us an indication about risk factors for certain diseases. Also important to note is that morbidity or illness is monitored by examining prevalence and incidence, and the most common way to obtain data about morbidity is via surveys. Much of my research in health disparities is in the area of sexual health. So, by way of example, let's consider morbidity as it relates to HIV. Here's a graph illustrating diagnoses of HIV infection among adults and adolescents by race ethnicity in the U.S. in 2015. This graph shows us that the largest percentage of diagnoses of HIV infection each year in the United States and 6 dependent areas was for Blacks or African Americans. In 2015, the percentages of diagnoses were 45% for Blacks, 27% for whites, 24% for Hispanic Latinos, 2% each for Asians and persons of multiple races, and less than 1% each for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders. What else is noteworthy to you in this graph? All in all, a pretty startling situation for African Americans in particular. Why is this such an obvious representation of health disparities? Well, for one, you should be inclined to ask, what is going on here, since African American morbidity rates are much different from the racial ethnic composition of the country? Is there a difference in risk behavior? If so, what is the context in which those behaviors are occurring? Is there a healthcare access issue? Just a few questions that should be spurred when you see data such as these. Anything else stand out to you in these graphs? Take a moment to review on your own. Mortality is another important epidemiologic term. Mortality is the measure of the number of deaths in a population. Age-adjusting rates is a way to make fairer comparisons between groups with different age distributions. For example, a county having a higher percentage of elderly people may have a higher rate of death or hospitalization than a county with a younger population, merely because the elderly are more likely to die or to be hospitalized. Age adjustment can make the different groups more comparable. This graph illustrates rates of death due to HIV infection by geographic region and race ethnicity in the most recent 5 years for which data were available. Blacks or African Americans had the highest rate in each of the 4 regions. The rates among Blacks and Hispanics varied greatly by region, but the rates among the other racial ethnic groups did not vary much by region, except for being somewhat lower in the Midwest than anywhere else, or than elsewhere. The rates among Blacks and Latinos were higher in the Northeast than in the other 3 regions. Only in the Northeast was the rate among Latinos several times higher than the rate among whites, American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Asian Pacific Islanders. In the West, the rate among Hispanic Latinos was slightly lower than the rate among American Indians and Alaska Natives, and slightly higher than the rate among whites. The data for this slide come from death certificate data compiled by the National Center for Health Statistics. Take a moment to see if there is anything else noteworthy to you in this graph. Infant mortality is yet another measure of death. It is defined as the total number of infant deaths within the first year of life divided by the total number of live births times 1,000. This indicator allows for comparisons to be made between populations and across societies without having to account for differences in health behaviors among the individuals. Here is a graph illustrating the infant mortality rates by race and ethnicity of mother in the United States. What do we see when we look at this graph? In this graph, we see that the overall trend in infant mortality is that deaths are decreasing among all racial ethnic groups. Good news. We also see that the highest rates of infant mortality occur among Black, non-Hispanic women, nearly twice as high as white, non-Hispanic females. Is this a surprise to you? What do you think could be happening to cause this disparity? As an additional note, this week you have another opportunity to view a film that helps illustrate some of what I've presented in this lecture. This week, I'd like you to watch the episode entitled When the Bow Breaks from the documentary series Unnatural Causes. In particular, pay attention to the discussion about infant mortality and the comparisons drawn between Black and white women. In your personal reflection journals for the week, summarize the episode and respond to 3 of the comprehension questions posted in the Week 3 course content folder. Now, let's explore another epidemiologic indicator known as the leading causes of death. This slide shows the comparison between the top 10 leading causes of death in 1900 compared to those in 2014. How would you characterize the difference between those 2 time periods? Generally speaking, we see a shift from infectious diseases to more chronic diseases as the leading causes of death. Also of note, though, is that some of the leading killers in 1900 remain on our top 10 list today. Now, I'd like to compare the leading causes of death by racial and ethnic group. First, we see here that the causes are as we saw them on the previous slide, listed 1 through 10, with heart disease being the number 1 killer among whites, all the way to suicide rounding out the top 10. All the way to nephritis, rounding out the top 10. This slide illustrates the leading causes of death for Blacks. Take a moment to review this table. What differences do you note when comparing Blacks to whites? What similarities do you note? What has entered the top 10 list for Blacks that was not there for whites? Why do some of these differences exist? Are some of these differences surprising? As you may have already guessed, I'll reveal each of the racial and ethnic groups separately. Essentially, think of these same questions as you see the leading causes for each racial ethnic group. So, for instance, I would say that the most noteworthy differences between whites and Blacks are in the chronic lower respiratory disease, number 3 for whites and number 7 for Blacks, Alzheimer's disease, number 6 for whites and number 9 for Blacks, diabetes, number 7 for whites and number 5 for Blacks, and nephritis, number 10 for whites and number 6 for Blacks. Also of note is that septicemia or blood infection and assault homicide entered the list for Blacks and were not among the top 10 leading causes of death for whites. Now we see the leading causes of death for American Indians. What differences do you note when comparing American Indians to Blacks? What about in comparing American Indians to whites? What similarities do you note? What has entered the list of top 10 causes of death for American Indians that was not there previously? And why do some of these differences exist? Also, are some of these differences surprising? Of note would be that we see a few more illnesses enter the list, such as suicide on the list for whites, but higher for American Indians, and cirrhosis. Also, unintentional injuries are in the top 3. What could help explain this? When we delve a bit deeper into American Indian health issues later in the term, we'll discuss some of the reasons for this. Now we see the leading causes of death for Asians and Pacific Islanders. What differences do you note when comparing APIs to American Indians? What about comparing APIs to to Blacks? And what about to whites? What similarities do you note? Has anything entered the list of top 10 causes of death for APIs that was not there previously? Why do some of these differences exist? And are some of these differences surprising? Noteworthy here could be that flu pneumonia is highest for this group compared to the others that we've seen. Also, besides the ranking of Alzheimer's as the 9th leading cause of death for APIs compared to 6th for whites, and the fact that cirrhosis entered the list at number 7, these two groups are fairly similar. And last but not least, this slide illustrates the leading causes of death for Latinos. What differences do you note when comparing Latinos to APIs? What about comparisons to other groups? What similarities do you note? Has anything entered the list of top 10 causes of death for Latinos that was not there previously? And what do some of these differences exist, or why? And are some of these differences surprising? A few things to note among the Latino population include cirrhosis entering the list again. Also, we see unintentional injuries ranking in the top 3. Again, we'll explore some of the context surrounding these diseases and illnesses when we discuss Latino health issues later in the term. Since the 19th century, physicians have been laying claim to social conditions as determinants of health, but not until more recently has the moniker social epidemiology been used. Social epidemiology assesses the social distribution and social determinants of states of health and is the basic belief that social conditions influence health. This facet of epidemiology doesn't focus on specific disease outcomes, but rather suggests that the vast majority of diseases are affected by the social world around us, and that the environment places constraints on individual choice. As it relates to social epidemiology, behavior occurs in a social context. For instance, the social environment influences behavior by shaping norms, enforcing patterns of social control, providing or not providing environmental opportunities to engage in certain behaviors, and reducing or producing stress for which certain behaviors may be an effective coping strategy. So what are some examples? What about our eating habits? Where do children, who later become adults and have children of their own, develop their norms for preparing foods or selecting certain foods? Is it from one's culture? From lessons learned within the family? Perhaps having close access to a grocery store versus a corner store where the fresh food selection is very different. Think of examples from your own experiences to help illustrate how our behaviors occur in a social context. So, this all begs the question, should we place our efforts in public health on changing behavior, or should we focus on changing environment? As a behavioral scientist by training, I think, of course, that we should encourage people to stop smoking, wear seatbelts, and eat healthier foods. But what about the 50-year-old smoker who has been smoking cigarettes since the age of 15 and has a spouse who also smokes? Is it enough to counsel that person to stop smoking, or should we consider the barriers and facilitators in their environment that surround their behavior? Should we consider the spouse and their smoking behavior and how that impacts the client? Should we consider labeling on cigarette packaging or other media that could promote quitting? Research suggests that we should consider the environment in which behavior occurs and devise solutions that are multifaceted that may address behavior, but also, more importantly, the environment. This will yield the biggest impact on healthy changes for healthy lifestyles. So, in summary, there are different degrees of racial ethnic diversity in the U.S. I attempted to illustrate that by the demographic tables that we saw. There are variations in health status as evidenced by different health outcomes among U.S. racial and ethnic groups, and some populations have consistently better health status than others, phenomena that we saw illustrated in some of the graphs and tables, such as the leading causes of death table. And social epidemiology may be one way to help explain the disparities that we see in health, and also an avenue for devising solutions. Please see this week's folder for assignments, deadlines, and other reminders. Talk to you soon.